Welcome to the Art of Boat Building. In today's episode, I'll be preparing the deck and hull of the Wood Duck 12 kayak and attaching them together. Using my orbital sander with an 80 grit sandpaper on it, I'm sanding down a couple of inches on the deck here so that the fiberglass tape will have a good surface to make a good bond to. In addition to sanding the edges of the hull, I also sanded the cockpit area for finishing in the future. I mainly did this now as it was easier to access while the deck was off. After I finished sanding, I then went over all of the sanded areas with a Scotch-Brite pad, mainly to degloss any of the low areas. While the deck was off and upside down, I took the opportunity to add the hatch spacer. There's also a hatch lip that goes here as well. However, it makes the hatch opening smaller, and I wanted to keep the opening as large as possible so that my access would be easier. Well, now that I've got all of the surfaces sanded and cleaned up my bevels, it's time to now fit the deck to the hull. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to dry fit it, and then what I'll do is I'll mix up a little epoxy up here for this end pour. And then we'll start fitting it to the hull. Fold it over and really get it bond down there, and then really pull on it to get it together. That holds it really a lot better than the green tape. And now that I've got all of the deck taped down to the hull, the next step is we're going to put some tape on the inside of the seam. And before I do that, I want to put some masking tape around the seam there, because we're going to tip it on its side, and we don't want the epoxy to run all the way out. That'll act as a little dam. So that'll be the next step. So now we're going to put some, reinforce that seam with this, I think it's 9-ounce tape that comes with the kit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the outside of it to measure out to where, actually I'm going to stop here at the bulkhead, because you can see that in there the bulkhead stops. So then I'll start a second piece that will start up here at the bulkhead and go to the back bulkhead, and then a third piece for the aft seam. So that bulkhead is about right here. So I'm going to make a mark here so I've got a place to measure to. And the back one is about there, about here. So I've mixed up a batch of epoxy here. Now, oddly enough, when I laid these three out, this is the foreship, midship, and aft. They're basically the same length, so I don't really need to worry too much about which one I use. So what I'm going to do is to saturate these strips, and you can see I've got some visqueen down here so that they'll release from it. And in this case, I don't want to be too shy with the amount of epoxy that I put on them, because I want them to really become well saturated. Okay, now I've got those well saturated. I'm going to now paint inside here on the seam. The directions talk about putting a fillet in there, but in my consultations with Nick Shotted, he says it's really an unnecessary step. So I'm not going to do that. In order to reach way out there, I have what Nick refers to as a stick with a brush, and that's essentially what this is. So by doing this, I will be able to reach all the way up there to the front. Of course, not concerned about here, and here I can reach just with my arms back and forth. So that's my next step, is I'm going to paint that seam inside here. A little light to turn on. I want to be pretty liberal with it. I'm wanting the joint to fill with the epoxy. Now I'll show that in the cockpit. It's a bit dark for the camera in this fore end. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll up this first piece so that it can unroll in there. Okay, now it'll be a matter of taking this roll and starting here at the bulkhead, and then I'm going to use my brush with the stick and push the tape the rest of the way up there. So you can see here, this is the seam that we're doing. You can see there's a little gap there. And that's what we really want to do, is to have that fill up. So by brushing the epoxy in here, we can get that to kind of fill that void up. And put enough on here that that tape will sit on there nicely. This is why we put the tape on the outside, so that if that runs through, it'll stop it. So I'll roll up another one now. This one wasn't quite as neat as the first one, but not as important since I can reach all of this one. I just take my finger and kind of make sure it down in there. I wasn't able to do that up in the upper bulkhead there because of but I tried to get up there the best I could with my brush. Pretty happy with that. Now we're going to let this cure before we flip it over. Otherwise we'd have tape falling down on top of our head. So we'll let that sit and cure properly before we do the other side. It's the next day, and the epoxy should have completely cured. I wanted to show you inside here. You can see right here is where that joint is, and you can see that that epoxy has kind of drained down and actually filled in and made a very nice fillet in there. So you can see why we put all this tape on the outside, otherwise that would have been all running down onto the floor. So the next thing to do is to get the boat righted and get this tape off. One of the things I didn't mention when I was putting this strapping tape on is that I folded the edges over so that it'd be easier to grab a hold of that and pull it off. You can see that If I hadn't, it's a little hard to, this stuff really sticks, so it's really hard to kind of get your fingernail under there. But by doing that, then it was really easy to remove them. Okay, that's it for the tape. Now there's some tape that where the epoxy leaked out from the edge is pretty well adhered to the kayak. So I mentioned that the tape stuck to this somewhat. Now that's because the epoxy actually came through the joint. Now that's exactly what we wanted to have happen, was to have that completely filled with epoxy. So I got the majority of this off just by picking at it, but the important thing here is now that we're going to file this off. This edge is very, very sharp, as you can see here, and so what we want is to have a little bit more of a relieved edge, so when we put the fiberglass on top here, it'll wrap around this nicely. And we're going to come down about an inch beyond this, down into this panel. So the best way to round this off is with a rasp, and this is called a 4-in-hand rasp. It's called that because this flat surface, there are two, a rough cut and a smoother cut surface, and on the other side there's a slightly curved, and then of course it has two different ones too. So basically 4 different files in your hand, so the 4-in-hand rasp. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go along here and we're going to clean this edge up. And by doing so, you can see that tape comes right off. Now we're going to want to get this so we have a fairly nice relieved edge. So that's a good start. Now, one of the reasons we want to use a file is because it's a hard surface, and using a soft sanding pad, you could round this off unevenly. But by using a hard surface like this, then you can keep that surface nice and clean. Now this is not a particularly bad spot here, but you can see how the epoxy came through the tape right there. So if I sanded that with a soft sanding pad, what I would end up doing, because the epoxy is harder than the wood, is I would end up sanding a dent into the wood here. But by using a hard surface like this, then that will stay across there and it'll keep it nice and flat. So that's kind of what we want right there. And if I run my finger on there, it's perfectly flat and smooth. So anyway, I need to go along the entire boat and relieve this edge and give it just a nice little round over. You can see this spot here. This actually where some strapping tape was, and you can see how the epoxy leaked out on each side of it there. Now, don't be afraid to use the more aggressive side of your rasp, especially when you've got a fairly large piece like that. You can see that it actually removes it a little quicker. And then we'll go back over it with the smoother side. If you're a little gentle with it, you can easily use that more aggressive side to get that off. So that now feels nice and smooth. things you'll notice as you're using this file is that it gets gummed up pretty easily. And you can use what's called a card file here, and it will clean. You go the direction of the grooves. And that'll clean your file up nicely. Also works on the rough side. So especially in using this, that tape tends to want to gum up in there. So use a card file to clean it up. You could also use a wire brush. This works a little better because the bristles are a little shorter, and you can see they're on an angle, so you only go one direction with it. So as we continue to prep our deck for the fiberglass, now I've gone over it with the rasp and got pretty much rounded off the way I want it. Now, one of the nice things about this is that it's hard, and it will, by making a long stroke, any kind of little irregularities that may have occurred by working in short sections, this will take all of that out and ferret out nicely. So basically what I'm going to do is go across with long strokes and round that corner off. I'm going to go down into this panel because I'm going to be, the fiberglass is going to come around here, so I'm going to need some tooth in it for it to bond to. Now, as that fabric comes around about an inch, I'm going to then run the epoxy farther down so that I can blend that all in. So before I do that, this entire section I'm going to have sanded so that it can be prepped for that. Now as I'm working, I can feel and see little drips that are in there. So by going over this, it just takes off those high spots. So I can tell by the way it feels is that it's getting much more fair than down here where I can feel more drips. This is 80 grit sandpaper. I'm drilling a hole through the end pour for the carry handle. I also rounded over the sharp edge of the bow so the fiberglass cloth would lay nicely over it. Well, I'm just finishing up preparing the deck in order for us to fiberglass it and down around the edge. Now I've gone on this first panel here and sanded down at least a couple of inches so that we can take that fiberglass and wrap it around the hull. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just going over the top of the deck, getting off any little spots that are high, and also roughing the surface up so that the epoxy will have something to bite to. I'm using 80 grit on this, and one of the important things here is to use a stiff pad behind it as opposed to a soft one. If you use a small soft one, you tend to maybe get some dips and rises in there, where with a long board like this, it's much easier to stay true and fair. So anyway, I just go over and knock off the high spots with that and get it smooth to my hand. And once I get that done, then I'm going to take Scotch-Brite here and then go over it with the Scotch-Brite, and that'll dull down any kind of low spots and really give it a good surface for it to bind to. So that's the process. And then in the next episode, we will get some fiberglass on the deck. So as always, thanks for watching, and remember, if you're going to make it beautiful.